Yeah, hey everyone. It's great to be here again. Actually, I even put in a slide into my talk of just like previously at ETH Dubai, because it's been great to be here for the third year in a row. And if we look back, actually, it turns out that the last 2 years, the talks actually ended up being more relevant than maybe initially one could expect. The first year we talked about EIP 3074, which back then it looked like might have trouble reaching Ethereum, but now it's right back in the mix. If you go on Twitter, you read about account abstraction, you'll see the number a lot. So it's nice to see that basically foreshadowed that 2 years ago already. And then last year we talked about another EIP that was involved with 4844, and of course I think that was one of the kind of the big ticket items of kind of Ethereum's roadmap in the meantime, and now we finally have kind of data scaling on Ethereum, which is great. So hopefully we can continue this trend this year. And I want to talk a little bit about staking economics. And so I think, I'm not sure, this is a slightly outdated. Doesn't matter. It's a minimally outdated version of the talk. You know, that's the fate of making changes last second. But it's fine. So basically, a colleague of mine and I, Casper and I, we published a research post on staking a couple months ago in February, and it took a while, but it blew up a little bit on Twitter, like over the last few weeks, and not necessarily in the best way. People were a little bit taken by surprise, and specifically we kind of had a main post where we talked about like the long-term vision for where we could see staking go, but then we also had a proposal for more smaller short-term change, and I think this created the impression that basically there was some sort of push to rush in some change to the issuance policy of Ethereum. So I just want to start with a disclaimer, and that's the slide that I added last second, like a disclaimer slide. But basically, so disclaimer is just, I mean, of course, the staking mechanism of Ethereum, the monetary policy, all of these are super sensitive parts of the protocol, right? And so while a lot of the day-to-day governance process of Ethereum is relatively technocratic, and it's not necessarily every small decision the community is very actively involved, even though, of course, all the governance calls are public, and in principle, everyone can join. These more sensitive parts of the protocol, those can never be changed without very broad community buy-in, right? So our intention when we published this post in February was really just to say, hey, here's our thoughts, we want feedback on this, and we want to try to start convincing the community that a change might be necessary, right? And so I think it was on us to not communicate that well, and it created this impression that we were trying to rush through a change. That's not the point, right? So what I'm here today as well is I'm just trying to basically take a step back and try to build this intuition of like, why do we think at least long-term, a change might be necessary, and then what might that mean for the short-term? But again, if we can't convince you, none of this will be at all relevant, right? So take that in mind. Okay, but with that, kind of let's dive in. I basically have 3 parts of this. The first part is the current trend. What is the current situation in terms of staking on Ethereum? And then in the second part, we'll look at what potential drawbacks might there be to this current path that we're on. And then the third part will be, what could we do about it, right? So for the current trend, this is a picture of a graph of just the total amount of ETH that is staked on Ethereum, right? And all the way from, at the very left, the launch of the beacon chain, all the way up to today, or I guess now a month ago or something. And as you can see, of course, the speed of inflow of new stake varies a little bit over time, but overall the trend is quite clear, right? It's a continued growth in the amount of ETH staked. And so we looked at this, and in general, I think on in the Ethereum roadmap, we're kind of getting to a point, and that's also why not everyone loves this word kind of endgame, right? But like we're kind of getting to a point where more and more dimensions, the remaining Ethereum roadmap becomes clearer, and we're basically starting to try to define potential endpoints where not now, not 2 years from now, but potentially some point down the road, 5, 10 years from now, we could reach a state where the chain is basically just finished, right? In some regards. And we looked at this and we were like, okay, what actually drives this trend? Where are we headed? Is this something that is already finished? Can we basically just leave this and never touch this again? Does it require changes? Let's try to understand this properly. And that's kind of what triggered our research. And on a very simple basis, right? Like why is a certain amount of ETH staked today, right? And that it's just a very simple kind of economic mechanism, of course, right? Demand and supply. So how much is the chain willing to pay for stake, for security? And how much do people who might want to stake, how much do they have to be paid to come in and actually do the staking, right? So basically, we just looked at it as like a demand, a supply, and then the current equilibrium point is just the intersection of these two curves, right? That very, very simple principle. And so first we looked at the demand curve, right? How much is the protocol willing to pay for security? And that's well defined inside the protocol, right? There's this issuance curve. So basically, at very low levels of stake, you can see all the way to the left where the beacon chain initially started. The protocol is willing to pay a lot. You can see even like say at 5 million or something, it's 8% yearly, because you just need some minimum amount of stake for the network to be secure, right? And so it starts out very high, and then as more and more ETH comes in, it kind of gradually drops off. And in particular, also we included like there's the solid green line, which is just what the protocol pays, but that's not the entire kind of demand side. There's also additional yield that you get access to as a validator. So far, that's mostly MEV, although of course this year everyone loves talking about restaking, and so in the future this graph might include not just MEV. We'll see about that. So that's the demand side, and kind of three small takeaways from that graph. So one, the current issuance kind of policy, it is very kind of intentional about ensuring a safe minimum participation, right? By just keep paying more and more and more until you make sure that some minimum amount of people always participate. It also implies some sort of diminishing marginal value of an additional staker, right? Because as you can see, like as more people come in, the protocol is less and less willing to pay for security. But it's on the upper side, it's not very intentional, right? You could be, with that curve, you could reasonably see 10% of ETH staked. You could see 99% of ETH staked. There's not really anything that specifically determines where we will end up with, right? And so in order to understand what are plausible, like long-term outcomes, we also have to look on the other side, the supply side, right? And so the supply curve, while the demand curve was nicely defined in protocol, you could draw it explicitly. The supply curve, that just indicates any given ETH holder, how much would you have to pay them to convert them into a staker, right? Like what do they need to take the ETH and stake? And of course you can't observe that. You could send out questionnaires to ETH holders, but that's a bit of a hopeless task maybe. So there's one thing you can observe, right? There's one thing you can observe, and that is, of course, at any moment in time, where on the demand curve are we, and then that must be the intersection point with the supply curve, right? So you can't actually see the entire shape of the supply curve, but at least you can basically like sketch it and say, hey, it intersects the dashed green line at this point and this point, and as we saw in the beginning, more and more ETH is coming in. So what that means for the supply curve is that basically the supply curve has been coming down over time. So basically, people are willing to stake at lower and lower yields empirically, at least in the past. And so the question was basically, what is the shape of the supply curve, and will it keep coming down? And for that, actually, you have to make one more kind of step into the analysis, and in particular, there's two types two ways for ETH holders to take the ETH and start participating in staking that really are quite different and really have different impacts on this supply curve. And that's basically solo staking on the one hand, and staking via professional operators like LST providers on the other hand. And so we looked at this comparison, right? And there's many different dimensions in which you can kind of compare the two, but I just picked those few. Right, so on the right cost side, you have some initial differences. So solo staking comes with relatively high fixed costs, and that's not just buying a node that you can run at home, right? But it also means learning about how to stake, right? Like actually like taking in the time, time is valuable for people, right? So like actually setting this all up, that is a big kind of one-time initial investment. And then you still have some variable cost, right? You have to pay for your internet, you have to pay for your electricity and whatnot, but it basically, it relative, like a lot of your costs come from this fixed side. On the SSP, like staking via SSPs, this, I don't know, it's not a very popular term. So whenever you see SSPs, you can just think LSTs, right? So that's just professional operators. And they, of course, for a user that wants to stake with them, there's no fixed cost whatsoever, right? Basically, you only pay some kind of fee, 10% of the revenue they generate for you or something, and they internally take that to also offset their kind of fixed cost. The differences become more pronounced as we kind of look at other aspects. So another question that determines whether you're willing to stake or not to stake is, of course, the risks, specifically with slashing. Slashing is supposed to have inherent risks from the slashing side. Then there's also like additional risks of just accidents. If you're a solo staker, all you have to trust is in your own skills, which easier said than done, though, of course, because some of us are, of course, very technical, are maybe very comfortable with running a node at home. Other people, not so much. I personally know people who learned how to use the command line specifically to be able to home stake, which is great, of course, right? But like it means that, of course, maybe they are less confident that if anything goes wrong, they can immediately react and fix that. On the other hand, with SSPs, you have different types of risk. You have to trust that the operator will not do anything wrong with your ETH, right? You have, with these on-chain versions, you have smart contract risk, you have governance risk, right? It's a very different kind of type of calculus of like whether you want to stake or not. Convenience, I already talked about it, like solo staking, you need the technical skills. SSPs, usually it's one click, right? You go on Coinbase, you click earn, you go on Uniswap, you swap from ETH to STETH or RETH or something, very convenient, right? And lastly, liquidity, right? I mean, after all, liquid staking tokens, not all SSPs issue LSTs, but most of them do. Again, STETH, RETH, CBETH, right? All of these examples for liquidity you get if you stake with them. So solo staking, you don't get any liquidity. SSPs, you do. And how useful those kind of tokens are, like how useful is STETH, that's of course a question, but at least there's a potential for it to meaningfully kind of give you back liquidity over your staked ETH. So looking at this, kind of there are a few observations. One is that the left side, right, how attractive it is for someone to solo stake, that varies a lot between ETH holders, right? So you have the people, the enthusiasts, the very technical people for whom that is very easy to do, and then you have people for whom you'd have to pay them a lot for them to even consider running their own node, right? And so what that means in terms of the supply curve is that the supply curve for solo stakers is relatively steep, right? And so that would naturally kind of limit how much stake you would see in the network at any given time. Whereas, and I also like have a summary slide here for that. Whereas in contrast, for SSPs, it's a much more homogeneous kind of risk and kind of cost spectrum across different ETH holders, right? So if you look at like the most enthusiastic SSP kind of participant, how much do they need to be paid per year in order to come in versus say the median ETH holder right now. The median ETH holder does not yet stake or participate, but what kind of APY would they need to see on for LSTs to consider it, right? It's at least significantly lower than what they would have to see to consider running their own node at home, right? And so basically SSPs lead to a flattening of the supply curve. Right now it's basically for a bigger portion of the ETH holder set, it is at least feasible, at least a potential option to come in and participate in staking. One extra aspect here as well is if you look at like how do these trends develop over time, right? And again, we saw this graph of over time more and more people coming in and staking. The cost structure for solo stakers remains relatively unchanged. Of course, as we've had the beacon chain around for longer, people are trusting more that the software works correctly and that it's something they might feasibly be able to do, but in principle, most of the costs stay the same. On the SSP side, there's a lot of kind of trends that make them more attractive over time. So there's, of course, the smart contract risk, there's the governance risk, all of these kind of become more robust, become more trusted over time. You have operators that start building out a track record, right? You have the LSTs that gain adoption over time. It's more attractive to hold an LST versus raw ETH, as you can use the LST in more places, right? SSPs in principle have, economies of scale, right? So we're basically like, or can at least have them, where as they gain adoption, they can basically turn around and in turn lower their fees, or at least in a competitive environment over time. They might do this, which would draw in even more users. And the last one, of course, is already like that. That's hinting at like some of the kind of concerns we might see with kind of this development. There's also this aspect where as an SSP kind of has more and more assets under management, at some point there becomes a question of like, if ever anything would go wrong, right, and they would get slashed, is it even feasible that they wouldn't just be bailed out, right? Like if they become too big at some point, is it actually credible that the network would be able to stand up to them and basically be like, sorry, no bailouts, right? And that's a question where at least over time that tail risk might basically just be perceived as not even existing at all. So anyway, all of these kind of factors, right? If you now take that together and talk about like where are we headed with kind of staking? So we have the demand side, where we have the kind of the curve that's unopinionated towards the higher side. We have the supply side, where basically over time the curve gets flattened and keeps coming down. And so we looked at this, and what we saw was that like, it's not clear where this ends up, but one observation is at least it is very plausible that this will keep going quite a way, right? Like if you look at this, it is very plausible that staking in the long term, if we make no changes, we could get to 70, 80, 90% of ETH stake. That is at least a plausible outcome, right? And so we would at least have to make sure we would be comfortable with that. Will this definitely happen? No, right? But it could happen, and so at least we should make sure that we would be comfortable with such an outcome if it were to happen. Otherwise, we need to do something about it. And so here, we just to illustrate, right? We sketched like out, and you can see even relatively small changes to like what the supply curve would look like would end up making a big difference in where we would end up in. I'm also way too slow, is what I'm realizing, but I'll speed up a little. So what are the concerns we have? We looked at this again, and we again, I didn't end up including the disclaimer slide, but we here really is just this, Kasper and I, two colleagues. We don't represent the EF, we don't represent the core devs, this is two people's opinion, right? So take it with that context. So what concerns did we have looking at this? A few, right? And so I wanted to just go through them. I numbered them, so as we go through them, you can kind of keep track of them. Like something about yield, solo staking viability, protocol security, the moneyness of ETH, and then also, even though not everyone loves this point, minimum viable issuance, right? So let's go through them one by one, and then see how much time we have left. First off, yield. Let's talk about yield. That's actually a non-obvious point. So basically, oftentimes people look at this as like the issuance curve for Ethereum, right? And then they are like, okay, so basically what this graph tells me is that basically at 20 million ETH staked, I make 5% of profit a year, or at least revenue a year for staking, and at 100 million staked, I still make 2%, right? So basically it kind of flattens up, but it always kind of stays significantly above zero. So I still make money all the way to the right? What this does not take into account though is issuance is not just free money coming out of nowhere, right? Issuance is really just a transfer from raw ETH holders to ETH stakers. And what that means is that as more and more people stake, you yourself start to pay more and more for your own rewards, right? So there's this aspect of how basically printing extra ETH just dilutes existing holders, and as more and more of the holders had stakes, basically more and more of this is just a pure accounting change, right? You can imagine, I don't know, if you have a country and the country has government employees, right? And so basically the government pays with taxes for the employees' salaries. As more and more of the people in the country work for the government, at some point they pay 100% in taxes, right? Because they have to pay for their entire own salaries, right? So basically, you might still earn 100,000 nominally, but you have to pay 90,000 in taxes because 90% of the people work for the government, right? And so your net income is only 10,000, right? And so basically we looked at this and we're like, wait, this is just nominal yield. This doesn't actually tell you how much actual revenue you have in a year. And so we adjusted this, right? And so now you can see the zero line here, and basically we just, instead of having it added, we just basically put it below the zero line so it's easier to understand now. Same graph, but you can see the solid green line goes all the way down to zero. So basically the actual real yield you make if everyone stakes is of course zero from issuance, because it's really just a reshuffling. Everyone's balances goes up by 2% a year. If that was a way to actually generate money, we should just make everyone's balance go up by 10% every year. That's not real yield. You still have the incentive to stake though, right? It's not like you would leave the staking set, because if you're one of the few remaining raw ETH holders, your balance actually effectively goes down by 2%, right? Of course, the number would stay the same, but your share of the overall market cap would go down by 2%. So the incentive still stays, but it basically now mostly comes from this dilution protection side instead of the actual real yield. And yeah, just to try to summarize this, so staking rewards mostly real yield if we have relatively low participation, and so in that point, in that world, staking is actually like a profitable service by specialists. At high staking participation, it's the rewards you get from the protocol are mostly just offset by the inflation they cause. Where in a way you can think about it as, at that point, staking is more of a duty. Everyone who wants to be part of Ethereum basically just has to stake, or like stake indirectly via SSPs or something, but you don't actually earn money with it anymore. And so again, in either of these situations, you still have an incentive to stake, but basically it's worse for stakers if most of your incentive comes from this kind of dilution instead of the real yield. So that's kind of one thing that basically just gets worse over time. By the way, none of this yet talks about any solution to these problems, right? So maybe some of these might be inevitable. I'm not claiming that necessarily there's an easy solution for any of this. It's just about pointing things out that get worse over time as more people stake, right? And maybe anyway, so. Second point is solo staking viability. That's a big one and a very controversial one. Of course, for a lot of for Ethereum security, for censorship resistance, it's very, very valuable for us to not just have a few kind of big parties running validators, but to also have like this long tail of people running nodes at home. And a lot of the relative competitiveness of solo staking becomes worse as more people stake. And then that's for several reasons, right? So one, you have kind of the economies of scale for large centralized operators. Of course, this varies within the type of operators. Say someone like Coinbase has a lot of economies of scale because basically the amount of actual nodes they run doesn't vary much with the amount of people staking with them. Whereas someone like Lido, they try to actually spin up new operators, I think per 1% of ETH under management or something. Something like Rocket Pool, of course, they have a much more kind of linear cost profile as well. So the economies of scale, some SSPs benefit from them more, others less. But solo stakers don't benefit from them at all, right? Because you run your set of nodes, you don't get any benefits. A really problematic one as well is that basically we have different types of yield, right? Like I showed you MEV, I showed you internal revenue. As the internal revenue basically goes closer and closer to zero, as more people stake, more and more of your actual income in the year comes from external sources. Right now that's MEV, that could be restaking. And those also, basically for small solo operators, like you only occasionally win the MEV lottery, so there's a lot of variability in your rewards, whereas big operators can smooth that out. And with restaking, we don't know yet where that exactly goes, but at least it's very plausible that there might be some like we already see some trends where not all types of restaking activities might be available for small node operators. A few other points, the LSTs become more and more useful as they gain adoption. So basically, as there's more money under management by LSTs, basically not having access to that as a solo staker becomes more painful. And then that's a weird point, I wasn't even sure whether to include that, but actually, because we were talking about nominal and real yield, there's actually this unfortunate aspect where basically in many jurisdictions you get taxed on your like nominal income in a way, right? Like it's the same thing with say capital gains, right? The capital gains are not inflation adjusted. You actually have to pay for whatever your balance went up, even though inflation also maybe ate away of some of that. And same thing, like if your ETH balance went up by 2%, you still have to pay taxes on that 2%, even though everyone's ETH balance went up by 2%. And so effectively, in dollar terms, you didn't make any profit, right? So basically, as we slide further to the right, for solo stakers, that adds an additional kind of burden, meaningful burden, whereas SSPs, generally LSTs can be structured in a way where this is kind of shielded away and you don't have to pay that. Of course, not tax advice, but this again, it is something that we've heard multiple times raised as a concern by solo stakers, and I think it's valid. Next point, protocol security. That's one, of course, I'm more on the core dev research side. I'm personally really worried about this. We already talked a little bit about this too big to fail. Can we actually slash very large staking entities, as they say, have 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of all ETH in existence under management if something goes wrong? More and more unclear, I would say. And of course, the whole point, why does staking secure the network? Slashing is a crucial part of that. So it really is very unfortunate for the network to lose this. In general, by the way, like not just for large centralized parties, if a lot of the of the ETH in existence is staked and there's a mass slashing even across multiple staking providers, that might become a concern. Also, and that's maybe again a bit more of a niche concern, but I'm personally really worried about this, is just like as you onboard more and more of the long tail of ETH holders, that means you onboard those people with additional layers of intermediation, right? So you have these intermediaries, you have ETFs that maybe stake under the hood, you have L2 bridges that maybe stake implicitly just under the hood when you deposit your ETH into the layer 2 and everything. So you have more and more of whereas of course the people that stake today, that's home stakers that made that choice very explicitly, or that's maybe people that stake with LSTs, but they also specifically made a choice as like a trade-off of the risk profile and everything, right? So they are like informed, give informed consent to the kind of the risk side, right? So the problem here is that we have less and less of a connection between the people providing the capital and the operators that might end up basically making the decisions, not just, by the way, about making mistakes that get them slashed or even colluding for an attack, but also just in terms of censorship resistance, like do they censor, do they not censor, all these kind of questions, right? Where basically you have less and less people actually making decisions with their own capital and more these levels of interactions. It also means there's this intermediary governance layer that basically just implicitly now gets a lot of power delegated by users that don't necessarily actively make that choice. And it could mean that whereas today I think a lot of people, even people say that stake with LSTs, right? They specifically make a choice of like, hey, this LST looks like it's actually having the best interest of Ethereum at heart, right? I think there's been a lot of talk in the past, but Rocket Pool, Lido, all these people, of course, they are all very, very people who really have the best interest of Ethereum at heart and try to structure their kind of LSTs in a way to make sure that they never become a problem for the network. But as you have more and more people, like the average person who's maybe a retirement fund invests in ETH via an ETF, and then the ETF delegates to some staking protocol, they don't make a choice about which LST is the most Ethereum aligned, right? They just want the most yield, and so it becomes more of just a race to the bottom of whoever can just have the most raw profit. And by the way, I'll just stop the talk after we went through the concerns, and then just give you a little bit of an intuition of where we'll go. Otherwise, I think I'll run over time too much. But anyway, so there's two more concerns we had. The moneyness of ETH, right? It's a bit of a complicated term, like moneyness, like what even does that mean? Not everyone likes that. If you find Martin Köppelmann on Twitter, he'll try to fight you about ETH being money. But of course, there is such a thing as like the convenience of a token, right? Like ETH itself, it can be used for many different things. It can be used, of course, to pay for gas, and that will forever remain true, right? But it also it is used in DeFi. It is used as collateral. It's used in many different places. It's the main unit of account for how NFTs are priced, all these kind of things, right? And whereas in LST today, like stETH, ETH, or CBETH or something is less useful, less directly useful, right? But of course, as there's more and more of these LSTs in existence, and the amount of raw ETH goes down, right? At some point, you reach a point where basically it almost kind of starts to flip, right? Where you can imagine if there's twice as much of a specific LST in existence than there is of raw ETH, now all of a sudden all the default Uniswap pools are priced in that LST instead of in raw ETH, right? And so over time, slowly you would start to replace the money of the network, right? And you, instead of having raw ETH at the base, now you have like one LST, which further create some network effects. Now you'd really predict that there's a single LST that really wins out the race and outcompetes all the other competitor ones, which is not great. And it also means that we basically have this permanent additional kind of trust layer on Ethereum. You have this pressure of users, even if a user maybe would prefer to hold raw ETH, now if they actually want to use anything on Ethereum, they kind of need the LST. And I would say, again, personal take, I'm one of those ultrasound money people with the little emojis in the handle, which many people find unbearable. But I personally am worried that Ethereum is at severe risk here of just basically completely losing its monetary premium, right? Where ETH, I think, is a very maximally trustless asset. If over time ETH is no longer a thing, and instead the monetary product of Ethereum is just, hey, buy this LST that has this additional governance indirection layer and everything, I think basically it just won't be attractive as a money, right? I'd personally probably rather hold Bitcoin than an LST in terms of just the digital money kind of aspect. So that's another concern. And then the last one, just to briefly mention it, again, it gets a lot of kind of bad rap these days, but minimum viable issuance, the idea that in principle it's better for monetary properties of the network if you don't overpay for security, because that just leads to unnecessary dilution for ETH holders. But maybe my spin to this is, if you think about it, right, there's some amount of staking activity that is beneficial for the protocol and necessary for security, for censorship resistance, all of that. If you keep paying for more staking than that, all you do is now basically you take money and you literally just destroy value by basically just it becoming a public works project, right? You pay for more people to run nodes. Most of those, again, we talked about the supply curve. Most of those won't even be solo stakers coming in, because we already kind of mostly depleted that pool. So you just basically you pay for additional effort in the real world that ultimately creates no additional use anymore, right? So it's literally like a deadweight loss for everyone involved. So these kind of were the drawbacks we saw. I kind of already talked about those. I don't have time to actually really dive into what the proposal we made for how to change this. I just want to give you an intuition, right? So basically, we looked at this and we were like, hey, we are just not convinced that the current path we're on with the current issuance curve, we are already in the end game, right? We are not convinced that this is an issuance policy that you could just leave as is, go away, and 20 years from now Ethereum would still be healthy. And so if there's a change that we might need to make, what would it be? And so I'll just skip to just this, because this is the only slide you need out of that section to get an intuition. That's basically what we looked at as a potential alternative, right? So if you wanted to make sure that only, say, I don't know, a third of ETH is staked at most or something, what you could do is you could take the issuance curve, and just as it's very opinionated on the left, right, the green curve, ignore the red curve, that's just a little fun, but the green curve, right, on the left, it's very steep, and instead of then completely leveling off, now we just basically also make it steep on the right beyond a certain point, right? What that of course means is that in principle it would have to go negative. That's where this entire meme of negative issuance comes from. Of course, by definition, the total revenue of staking would never go negative, because then people would not just purely not stake. It comes with its own set of drawbacks. I'm not going to go into them too much. It mitigates most of the kind of drawbacks we saw. Solo staking is actually more nuanced. It mitigates some of the kind of competitiveness concerns. It does worsen the effects of external yield, so we would really need solutions for MEV burn, all these kind of things to mitigate this. It does reduce the net incentive to stake, so it's we'd have to see what the net outcome for this would be. So basically, takeaway here was just, and again, sorry that I'm running out of time, but you can go read our post. The point was that we were looking at this and we were like, hey, we just need to have this conversation. This is not something where we want to, this is not in any way close to a spec or something that we are confident we would want to move to. This is basically an initial post on the path to figuring out where do we want to go? Is this here a good direction? Do the drawbacks outweigh kind of the benefits that we would get from this? we're just like, hey, research community, let's start have this conversation. And so I think it's going to be a conversation hopefully we can have over the next few years. And then in a few years, if I give another talk at ETH Dubai, we can look back at this talk again and be like, oh yeah, interesting, that also pointed the direction we were going. And just because it had so much controversy, I just want to mention, we did have this proposal for like a more short-term change to the issuance policy, and that again drew a lot of drawback. And so I just wanted to say basically, where did we come from for that, right? So that looked very confusing to people. Again, we looked at this, the long-term way to go. If we ever wanted to basically go to a targeting mechanism where we try to keep the staking rate at like 30% or something, right? Like 20, 30, 40, whatever we would pick, 50%. It's much easier, much more seamless to transition to that world from today, where we already are at like a low level. So you just ramp it up to whatever you want, and then you just leave it at that. If we wait until we are at like 80, 90% of ETH staked, it's going to be much more painful because you have to actively kick people back out. How do you kick people out? By making it so uneconomical to stake that they voluntarily leave. That's really unfortunate. You don't want this to happen, especially because the first people to leave might be solo stakers that already have a harder time being competitive, right? So we looked at this and we were like, hey, maybe if we just slow down the issuance a little bit, in the meantime, we buy us more time to figure out this endgame. So that's where this proposal came from. Again, it's a very sensitive part of the protocol. This would never be changed without broad community buy-in. I think that was not communicated well. So here's the communication. Like, only if we can convince you all to make changes there would ever changes happen. But we see some motivation there. And most importantly, though, we just think this is a conversation we really need to start having, and hopefully this can be a good starting point for that. And sorry again for running out of time. But you can. It's basically, it was just a one-to-one summary of the post. So go read the post, and thank you.
All right, give it up for Ansgar.